So, hello everyone. I would like to welcome you to the first session, the one that is focusing on energy, security, and geopolitics. My name is Andreas Karios, and we will proceed directly to the presentations. Our first speaker is Petros Petrikos, PhD candidate here at the University of Nicosia. Mr. Petrikos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just give me one moment to upload my presentation.
Yeah, but let me make sure that everybody, we need to share it on the platform. So, the window. Yep. Hopefully, we are sharing this with you. Yep, okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Petrikos, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Petros Petrikos. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Nicosia, and my topic focuses on the everyday construction of regional security. It is a comparative study of small states' insecurity in the Baltic Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. And yes, that is not a typo. It is indeed the Baltic Sea that I'm focusing on specifically to observe and understand whether we can actually come up with a framework, a comprehensive framework that can be utilized in applying certain lessons from the Baltic Sea and region to the Eastern Mediterranean. Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to do here, and what I have already done in my working paper, is to present a conceptual approach that primarily focuses on first regional security as a concept, small states, ontological security, which focuses on the everyday construction of security processes in these two regions. Within that, we look at trauma, collective memory, and how these shape identities within each respective region. The types of cooperation that tend to lead to regional security mechanisms. And finally, the two case studies, the regions, specifically the small states of the Baltic Sea region and the region of the Eastern Mediterranean. The particular focus on the small states specifically is not done in order to exclude the other actors, the medium and the larger states in the region, but it is to observe the many differences, dissimilarities at a multilateral, at a bilateral level as well between small states when dealing with regional security issues, and as well as the everyday dialogue that shapes these processes, the understanding of how policymaking in terms of security and defense takes place. Next slide, please. Why should we begin by looking at regional security? How and why do we craft specifically regional security? States group together to do so in order to maximize safety, be free from fear and existential dread, specifically the concept of fear, the way we understand it within this approach to security studies and regional security specifically is something that is momentarily there it is not embedded as much within the policy-making process, but on the other hand, the anxiety mechanisms, the existential dread that is present there is something more repetitive as a process, if you like. So by utilizing this approach is to understand better why anxiety shapes security and insecurity like this. And therefore, by understanding it, we want to overcome anxiety and insecurity and create resilience, which is a theme that has been tried, it has been discussed in the literature multiple times, different approaches from mainstream to critical approaches to security, how to achieve resilience in this way. What I'm trying to do in this working paper is to come up with more of a collective framework that considers foreign security and defense policies at a regional level, looking at more vulnerable and limited players, and specifically small states, which within the concept of smallness, they lack in material resources and capabilities, but at the same time, they strive for recognition. They wish to project their self-image in certain ways so that they are considered as important, equally important players as larger states, and at the same time gain respect, maintain a given narrative that they wish to replicate both domestically to their own respective audiences in domestic politics, but at the same time export that same narrative abroad to gain trusted allies, to gain partnerships, and form protective mechanisms from overarching threats. Overarching threats in this particular scenario, when we're looking at these two different case studies, which I will be going in more depth later on, refers to, on the one hand, in the Baltic Sea region, we look at Russia, and of course, as both as the members of as the organizing committee of the conference, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs have referred to, it also impacts the Black Sea region, but it is unfortunately beyond the scope of this paper. And on the other hand, in the Eastern Mediterranean, we have Turkey as an overarching existential threat. Partnerships are formed in order to encourage interstate cooperation at a bilateral and multilateral level. And at the same time, small states and states in general do so in order to prioritize their interests in pursuing both physical and ontological security needs. The physical security part is what we can see, the infrastructural capabilities and limitations, the resources in arms, the people, the size. But when it comes to ontological security specifically, as the approach that I use as extensively discussed in the literature, is this sense of continuity in order and events. The daily, routinized, repetitive patterns that ensure confidence, building, crafting, constructing confidence, and in providing a more secure setting for these players that wish to enhance their ontological security through repetition, by constantly repeating and also showing to the outside world that we are confident in what we do, and we are capable of handling crisis, which might be indeed reflected in reality, but at the same time it might not be so. It's just maintaining a narrative that ensures confidence. Next slide, please. Some elements of insecurity within this framework include anxiety, as I've already mentioned. It's at a systematic level. It's the lack of tools to overcome perceived threats, and this is embedded both into state and societal levels as well. Trauma, which is this deeply embedded state of discomfort and agony. It reflects pain, prolonged suffering, and then it impacts collective memory. States that have already experienced trauma in the past from previous imperial colonial pasts, such as the Soviet Union in the case of the Baltic states, or the Ottoman Empire and other conquests in the case of the Eastern Mediterranean. So with that in mind, small states themselves, they're concerned with these limitations that they have. And size does matter, but at the same time, what really matters is how you utilize your limitations and how you try to overcome them as a small player in this global arena of politics. Next slide, please. How to craft regional security. We've talked about ontological security, the needs, the constraints that they have. We've briefly mentioned the overarching threats in each respective case. What I want to talk about is region making, utilizing ontological security to create and construct a regional security framework. The first factor that I take into account is territoriality and networks. The way narrative is used as a tool to shape and justify actions in each respective region it has a powerful impact, because it is something that is found both at the leadership level, but also something that society itself might choose to repeat. Territoriality in this sense, when we refer to territoriality, is not territory specifically, but is the concept of having borders when you don't necessarily have borders. If we look at individual member states within different organizations and blocs such as the European Union, the nation state has clearly defined territory. In the case of the European Union, however, there's no comprehensive mechanism, because of the lack of a federal system in place, to say that this space, and this is where language matters, this space is considered EU territory. Although this has started appearing in the narrative, in the literature, in the media, but it is also used as a mechanism to allow regions to shift, expand their memberships, as we've seen with the case of Ukraine and the Ukrainian invasion, how the EU has used language to say these are fellow Europeans under threat. And at the same time, in the case of the Eastern Mediterranean, the language used there is to create a de facto region. The Eastern Mediterranean does not have physical boundaries, physical borders. Their member states, the states inhabiting that region, they do have, but not the region itself. Then we look at two different processes, vertical and horizontal cooperation. Horizontal is essentially grouping together, cooperating, balancing of small and medium-sized powers against bigger threats, against specifically overarching existential threats. And on the other hand, vertical cooperation, which is smaller powers collaborating with bigger powers in a given region. This is not really applicable in either case that we're looking at here, because no such regional power presents itself that much in the collective to significantly encourage smaller players to group together to combat existential threats in the region. And finally, we look at bilateral and multilateral cooperation. Bilateral relations refers to both state to state, but also state to union or blocks. So in the case of state to state, that's interstate cooperation, or also third states collaborating with unions and blocks such as the European Union. Also with other international organizations. And the reason for this multilateral and bilateral cooperation is to gain added recognition, to sustain, project that self-image that we talked about previously as part of this framework, to ensure that there is representation of the state abroad in order to gain confidence and showcase that we are secure, we are confident partners that you can rely on. Next slide, please. The first case that we're looking at is the Baltic Sea region, which is inhabited by Denmark and Estonia, Finland, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and so on. But what I've highlighted here in this slide specifically are two sets of states. So the Baltic states and the Nordic states. Very often these states, when grouped together, they form the Nordic-Baltic cooperation. This is a classic case study where these states have grouped together in the past, but also in the present, to address the overarching threats such as Russia, which is how they perceive Russia as a threat, due to the legacy that the USSR has left, which is an emotionally linked approach and a constant fear and anxiety about the Russian legacy spreading again. And specifically the Baltic states, what they have done in this case is that they've held a strong voice within the EU against Russia, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. There's also contestation in the region where Russia has a presence in the Baltic Sea region. And what is applicable here is that there is bilateral, multilateral, and horizontal levels of security and defense policy formation, and which contributes to regional security through the EU. So in this case, these states also rely on actors such as the EU and the NATO to support their narrative. Please, next slide. And real quickly for this case, we can discuss more later during questions because I'm also running out of time, unfortunately. The region is composed by different actors, but what we're really interested in this case is small states, including Cyprus, Israel, Jordan, and in this case, we see that there are striking differences as compared to the first case. It doesn't follow the same pattern. It doesn't follow a holistic, emotional, traumatized approach, even after the Ottoman Empire's legacies. But what we do see is that certain states try to construct a unified approach against Turkey, even though Turkey and Israel are still reviving relations. They're still moving towards a more positive discussion these days. And the same case goes for Turkey and Jordan. But at the same time, we see actors such as the EU being influenced by countries like Greece and Cyprus to move out with a new narrative, saying that Turkey no longer abides by EU values and standards. Also, the newly released strategic compass dictates that Turkish involvement in the region is considered a hybrid threat and intelligence issue. There's a strong ontological need here for security that is presented. And then the very final slide, please. There are challenges, there are opportunities in this case. Evidently, this model developed against Russia in the Baltic region is more effective than the Eastern Mediterranean. There's a bigger group here that collaborates against overarching threats. But I do feel that these states in the Eastern Mediterranean do have an opportunity. There are some lessons to be learned here, especially when it comes to narrative and security framing. They do rely on other actors such as the EU in formulating and replicating the same narrative, and with the hope that other regional players such as Jordan and Israel in this case will shape and change their bilateral relations that they have with Turkey. And then the very final slide, which is, I'm closing up. So the working paper is still under development. There are some gaps, as you might see, but I'm really looking forward to the fruitful discussion, which will help me further address the conceptual challenges in this working paper. As we've seen, the model I'm proposing is not something that is 100% compatible with the EastMed, but I do feel that it highlights some challenges that the small states in the region do not really address at this point. I thank you for your attention. Do we have questions?
We will take questions at the end. Yeah. Thank you for a remarkable presentation, Mr. Petrikos. We shall proceed now with the presentation of Themis Zimas from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, who will deliver a presentation on data manipulation and weaponization. Dr. Zimas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I wish all success for the conference, for the journal, and for all this initiative, which hopefully will be very fruitful. Thank you also for the chance to participate and to participate via Zoom. I hope that I will be very soon in Cyprus and that I will meet you all in person. Now, the theme of my presentation is data weaponization. We tend to talk quite often about data and in particular big data, and also quite often about weapons, armed attack, wars. It's been common ground in our days, and maybe it will deteriorate even further. So the whole idea of my paper began to emerge from a quite strange, or I would say weird, publication article in the New York Times on November 27 of 2021, which had the title Israel and Iran Broaden Cyber War to Attack Civilian Targets. Now, the whole story is that Israel had launched a cyber attack against Iran, and in particular its fuel distribution central agency, making it difficult for ordinary Iranians to have access to their gas stations. And Iran retaliated by cyber attacking, one very famous LGBTQ dating site in Israel, revealing personal data of Israeli citizens and obviously causing some extent of distress among these individuals. So, what emerged to me as an idea is how quickly are we moving towards, and the answer is that we're moving very quickly, very rapidly, towards a situation, a condition within which, because of the fact that we upload such a big part of our personality and also of our state's functions in the cyberspace, the borders between what is a private and a public interest situation, as well as what is a legitimate and illegitimate target in the course of the conduct of hostilities, blurs more and more. As we know, I will try to explain very briefly what I mean. According to international law, the definition of armed attack is based on the existence of a weapon and of a target which is of significant impact for the affected state. Therefore, an armed attack is consisted of military activities of kinetic form or non-kinetic forms, given the expansion of the cyberspace against the territorial integrity and the political sovereignty of a state. Before the emergence of the cyberspace, we would talk only about one real world, the physical world, and kinetic weapons. As the cyberspace began to emerge, and now it has taken over a big part of our lives, we know, or we should know, that ontologically speaking, the cyberspace is also a real world, albeit not a physical world. But given that it is a real world which produces real consequences, it is obvious that armed attacks can take place within the cyberspace and through the cyberspace as well. In this sense, it is important to remember the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on nuclear weapons, which found that the type of weapon that is used is immaterial to the identification of the existence of an armed attack. What we need to have in order to have an attack is means which can be classified as weapons, targets which are critical for the integrity and the sovereignty of the state, and impact which is serious enough in order to put at risk through these targets and by these means the integrity and the sovereignty of the state. We also know by now very well that cyber attacks are inherent part of most modern military conflicts. We also saw that very clearly in the recent events in Ukraine, where both before and during the hostilities in the physical world, we had significant cyber attacks which derailed the capacities of the affected states to organize themselves in advance of the expected war and during the hostilities. But the mainstream approach, according to for cyber attacks, is that in order to be classified as a type of armed attack or as a type of hostility, it must have as target the critical infrastructure, civilian or military, of the affected state. The question then becomes are our data, what we tend to classify, to recognize as big data or collective data, such a potential target, such a crucial target which could be recognized as a type of armed attack? The initial answer would be no. The data that we provide to a private company are based on the confidentiality agreement between the company and ourselves. The breach of this agreement by the company or by another agent, state or private one, is a matter of a private law, not of public law, therefore not of public international law, and eventually not of armed hostilities, of armed attack and self-defense. So that's the initial answer, and it is a correct answer. That is also the case with the alleged leak of personal data in this story that I talked to you about of the LGBTQ dating site in Israel. The question is, what happens when the attacks are so continuous, so intense that a sentiment, a feeling, and a reality of public distrust towards the state's capacities to protect its own citizens emerges? Let's think of a situation that ahead of armed hostilities, or even completely distinctively from armed hostilities, we have a breach of confidentiality in the banking sector, and our personal data emerge in the surface, or where we lose money from our accounts, or a situation where bank run is triggered by such attacks, or political scandals, or our personal data in various sites, applications, you name it, whatever, which makes us, the citizens of a state, feel vulnerable, lose property, be exposed in terms of our personal lives or in terms of our critical things that we do. In this case, things become a bit more difficult. And they become a bit more difficult because we need to remember that one of the primary obligations of all states, given that all states by now in the world are constitutionally organized states, is to protect the personalities of its own citizens. So if you fail to do that as a state continuously, and because of the activities of a foreign state, of a third state, then obviously you're failing to protect a fundamental human right, a fundamental part of your mission as a state, which triggers distrust, which triggers discomfort, and potentially social unrest. Imagine, as I said, the situation of data being manipulated and eventually weaponized on the basis of our banking information or financial activities. The impact could be significant, and it could be even more significant in the case that such attacks precede a potential outbreak of hostilities, disorganizing the internal life of the state. Under such circumstances, my suggestion is that we need to think of data manipulation as data weaponization. And if data can be weaponized, then they could be used as means in order to have an armed attack at the cyberspace launched against us and therefore against our states. I conclude with this. As I said in the beginning, as a bigger part of our lives becomes interconnected through the internet and the cyberspace, and gradually we're moving from the two-dimensional internet to the three-dimensional metaverse, or the internet of things and the internet of all in the coming years or decades, we will see that the boundaries between private and public will become blurrier, will become continuously blurrier. That will mean that part of our personalities will be manipulated. And when I'm talking about part of our personalities, I refer to our personal data at collective volumes, will be weaponized in the course of hostilities. In this sense, we will have to think about international law and security in new terms, meaning that states will have to step in and try to regulate proactively, or at least protect this part of our personalities which are uploaded and then lost into the ocean of the cyberspace. That's all from my side. I hope I didn't take too long, and thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Gimas, thank you for your insightful presentation. We will collect questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you once again, and we will now proceed to our next presentation, which will be delivered by a doctorate student of University of Nicosia, Eleni Georgiou. And the topic of her presentation is, the title of her presentation is Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea Region, Two Alternative Routes for China's Belt and Road Initiative. The floor is yours.
Thank you for this. My presentation is already on the desktop.
Yeah.
το Firefox
Το minimize το περάμε. Ξανά minimize.
Okay. Can I share? Just a minute. Let me share screen.
Thank you. If you could go to the first slide already, thank you. So, as the title of this conference provides, the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean are in transition. Developments in the energy, the security, and the development sector are all affected by the prevailing circumstances at the international system level. So are there any similarities between these two regions that allow us to compare and contrast them? First of all, the USA's involvement as a an important player in the region, in the two regions, is perceived to be in retreat. The very famous restructuring of focus and resources towards the Indo-Pacific in order to counterbalance the rise of China, which is considered the main strategic rival of the USA, is a factor that determines developments in these two regions. At the same time, Russia's re-emergence as a revisionist state is also particularly relevant. Therefore, there is renewed great power competition in these two regions. Within this context, the rise of China and its solidifying regional footprint require a better understanding of its current or prospective influence. Another factor that will have to be weighted in, particularly as a result of the current situation in Ukraine, is whether further alignment between Russia and China will take place. We also need to consider efforts that aim at counterbalancing Chinese influence, the challenges that the Belt and Road Initiative creates for respective countries, and also the choices that decision makers have in their disposal at these new complicated geopolitical settings. Next slide, please. So a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's an initiative proposed in 2003 by Chinese President Xi. Initially, it was proposed as the Silk Road Initiative, which comprises mainly of a network of land corridors from China across Central Asia that reach Europe. Afterwards, it was developed to also include the Maritime Silk Road, which connects the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, and via the Gulf of Aden and the Suez Canal, they reach the Mediterranean and from there on Europe. Afterwards, it was the term One Belt, One Road Initiative was crafted so as to incorporate both the land corridors and the maritime routes. The One Belt and One Road Initiative is an umbrella theme for the construction along these routes that I mentioned before of several infrastructure projects such as ports, railways, highways, oil and natural gas facilities, electricity grids, and telecommunication networks. Its stated aim is to facilitate economic development through efficient trade, investment, and financing. In this regard, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea region are seen as gateways to Europe, which is the endpoint for Chinese economic and also possibly of political interests. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here we can see a map illustrating the various corridors of both the Silk Road Economic Belt as well as the routes of the Maritime Silk Road, and also the various railroad connections and ports that are developed or are under construction or envisaged. So just to visualize the complexity of the undertaking, and we can see how the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the main passages, let's say, for the of the Maritime Silk Road, while the Baltic Sea Region also has a few port facilities and land connections situated. The next slide, please. Now, concerning China's presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, first of all, it is important to note that China does not enjoy the same level of deep interaction with the Eastern Mediterranean states like the US and Russia. So there is virtually no military cooperation, and neither essential cultural bonds or no particular inroads to the domestic political landscape of states. However, a vast majority of states in the Eastern Mediterranean seek closer ties with China in order to attract trade, investment, loans, and technology. Furthermore, China, by virtue of its status as a permanent UN Security Council member and also as a potential leverage to USA or Russia, is particular relevance to states in the Eastern Mediterranean. Therefore, there is an increasingly expanding field of interaction and influence due to the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road. China's presence in the Mediterranean is mainly focused on developing infrastructure projects, energy projects, and projects in the telecommunications and transport sectors. The next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the most preeminent Chinese projects in the Eastern Mediterranean realized in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road include the port of Piraeus in Greece, in which the Chinese state-owned company COSCO has acquired 67% package. The port terminal in Haifa in Israel, which is developed by the Shanghai International Port Group, among other projects in Israel. In Egypt, Chinese development projects are mainly concentrated in the Suez Canal Economic Zone, which is made up of 6 ports and 4 industrial sites. And there are several other projects in Lebanon, with the port of Tripoli and the Tripoli Special Economic Zone, and also in Syria, Jordan, and other countries, which also focus in the field of port development and telecommunications and energy. Thank you. So concerning China's presence in the Black Sea region, likewise, in this region as well, China uses the BRI in a similar fashion. The most significant projects include in Turkey, which is, of course, as mentioned before, both a Black Sea region state as well as an Eastern Mediterranean state. A COSCO-led consortium holds a 65% stake in the port of Comport, which is Turkey's third largest container terminal. Plus, there are several other Chinese infrastructure construction projects on the Middle Corridor and on the Marmaray underwater channel. And additionally, in the newly announced Istanbul Canal, China seems to be a forerunner among the potential investors. In Georgia, Chinese state-owned companies are involved in the Baku-Tbilisi Kars Railway, in the deep-sea port of Anaklia, and other projects. Romania is a somewhat different case, in the sense that it has kept a very cautious stance vis-à-vis Chinese investments in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is due mainly to its more Atlantic, let's say, orientation. One project that should be mentioned concerns the deal for the development of the nuclear electric plant, a project which has now been abandoned. In Bulgaria, investments in the ports of Burgas and Varna and various motorways deals have been struck with Chinese investors. And Ukraine is another prominent example. It was, at least before the outbreak of the war, it was a pivotal state for the development of the Belt and Road Initiative. China's Oil and Food Corporation bought Noble Agri Resources Corporation. Chinese investors opened a grain terminal in the port of Mykolaiv. A deal to develop port infrastructure in Mariupol and Chornomorsk have also been struck, and also a train connection from Kiev to Boryspil Airport will be realized by Chinese state-owned companies. One very notable failure, which shows the tensions and the frictions that the development of the Belt and Road Initiative is causing, is the attempt to buy or carry out a takeover of the company Motor Sig, which has failed. The company was nationalized by the Ukrainian government, which was a not so profitable and preferable development, but it became necessary after intense US pressure. The next slide, please. Thank you. So Russia cannot be omitted from when discussing the Black Sea region. It's obviously one of the main countries, the interaction with which has to be considered. International sanctions against Russia instituted after 2014 have dealt a noticeable damage to the Russian economy, and therefore Moscow looks to develop deeper ties with China as a counterbalance to the animosity, let's say, developed by the West. Expanding bilateral ties are developing in strategic sectors such as trade, energy, and the military, also exchange of intelligence, and so on. Well, the main base and raison of this expanding bilateral ties is obviously the common criticism towards the USA. However, there are points of friction between Russia and China, which obviously impact the development of the BRI, and the existence of the Eurasian Union could be said to be one of these. The Eurasian Union and the BRI are addressed at least partly to a number of states. For example, in Central Asia, both of these endeavors are also relevant, and therefore this is a cause of friction. As a result, Moscow remains lukewarm towards the Belt and Road Initiative as it increases China's influence. And also the prospect of Russia forming an alliance with China is considered not so probable nowadays, because well, Russia will be the junior partner, and there will be a clear asymmetry, and this is another reason that impacts China's active endeavors under the Belt and Road Initiative. An example indicative in this respect is one concerning Ukraine. As mentioned before, it is an important transit country for the Belt and Road Initiative, as it could provide transport corridors to Central and Western Europe. Chinese companies have planned the construction of a deep sea port in Crimea that would be able to accommodate cargo from China. But following the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in 2014, the transit route via Ukraine was closed after Russia's ban on transit goods, whereas the planned deep sea port in Crimea was put on hold since Beijing refused to recognize the annexation of Crimea as per Russia's request. The next slide, please. The Belt and Road initiative in both the Black Sea region and the Eastern Mediterranean region has also wider political consequences. I mean, wider than the obvious economic impact that they have. One reason for this is that China uses the Belt and Road projects as a stepping stone, promoting more cross-cutting projects at the regional level. One notable example is the promotion of the digital Silk Road, whereby China is actively promoting the usage of Huawei, its national telecommunications champion, to play a leading role in the 5G rollout in countries of the Belt and Road Initiative. Furthermore, China uses direct flights to promote Chinese tourism towards countries of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank is increasingly being used as a lending facility for projects on the Belt and Road Initiative. And furthermore, diplomatic relations in key countries of the BRI are also promoted by China. In an effort to also promote its soft power Confucius institutes are greatly promoted in BRI countries. Thank you. As is evident, BRI is effectively increasing China's influence in these two regions, enabling its diplomatic connection to USA allies, and therefore weakening USA's appeal. Therefore, this has enabled USA's reactions, both in the Mediterranean as well as in the Black Sea region. For example, acting bilaterally, the US attempts to cancel or offset Chinese investments in these two regions, both in Greece as well as in Israel. The US tried to cancel or offset, as I said, the key Chinese initiatives and projects. Also in Romania, the nuclear electric deal was abandoned, as mentioned before, and in Ukraine with example of Motor Sig, when critical technology was concerned, the USA actively intervened. Acting at the multilateral level, Washington is also trying to engage the EU, so one of its main allies, in counterbalancing China, mainly through the use of strict regulatory framework that will enable the exclusion of Chinese companies from competitions at EU level. Furthermore, after active coordination with the USA, the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment was shelved after it was completed. The EU Strategic Compass now names China as a systemic rival. There is a regulation for the screening of foreign direct investment that is expected to exclude Chinese investors from some of the EU tenders. The Global Gateway Strategy, the 3Cs initiative, and the Build Back Better World are also aiming to facilitate funding for infrastructure development in the EU's wider neighborhood in order to provide an alternative to Chinese initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Clean Networks Initiative had been designed in order to restrict the rollout of the involvement of Huawei in the rollout of 5G. In the current geopolitical setting with the Ukraine war and various other challenges, it remains to be seen whether these balancing moves can deliver in the new multipolar environment and how they can impact policy making. So that was possibly it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Odysseas Christou of the University of Nicosia, who will explore the European Green Deal and climate change in the Mediterranean towards a just transition or regional insecurity. The floor is yours.
Yes, let me start by saying that that is not the topic of my presentation.
Okay.
I think you weren't informed. So yeah, I don't think I have time. How much time do I have?
15 minutes.
Okay. I don't think I have the time to cover all that. So instead, I am going to focus on the European Green Deal and the impact. Yes. Yes. So, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Okay, go ahead.
That is the actual title of my presentation. So I want to focus on the impact of the current conflict in Ukraine on the European Green Deal. Now, the impact on the Eastern Mediterranean is kind of an offshoot of that. So instead of doing both, because it would be impossible to do the Eastern Mediterranean without the current conflict, because EU-Russian relations are so pivotal to an understanding of how we've come to the stage that I'm going to be discussing was essential. I decided to focus on that part only. So, and then I'm going to go to the next slide. I don't have much time, but still, let me give you a brief introduction into what I'm going to be saying. So the presentation builds on my earlier work on defining and conceptualizing energy security, not only from the perspective of the region or EU affairs, but more generally, actually, or universally, one might say, and then apply that to the current situation that we're going to be discussing. So my basic research questions are, number one, has the EU integrated a widened conception of energy security? So what I'm going to be presenting is what is the trend in the relevant academic literature of moving from a traditional conception of energy security to a more encompassing, wider conception. The short answer to this question is yes, absolutely, as you will see. The second is, how have, and they indeed have, EU-Russian relations influenced the development of this conception? And they have done so in a very complex way, so both as a result of the current conflict, but also previously. In fact, one might say since the 1990s. And in addition to examining these two research questions, or I should say in applying them to the current situation, I will finish with some preliminary, some of which are way too preliminary, conclusions or estimations about these developments. So, number one, how likely is the European response to the conflict, and more specifically to Russia, to succeed? Secondly, what is the long-term outlook for Russian energy exports, not only as a result of the conflict, but more generally, as you will see? How do these developments affect the achievement of EU energy policy objectives, and how do they test our conceptual approaches? So let me start, like I said, with a very brief overview of the move from a traditional conception. Now, you will notice that my presentation is theoretical. I don't include references to the basic aspects of these theories, but I'm following, in the traditional sense, the standard IR approach that has come to be known more than anything else as the 4A's approach. Availability, affordability, accessibility, and acceptability. So this is basically an approach that focuses mainly on energy security. You may remember that at the very beginning, the foreign minister talked about energy security precisely in this way. So security of supply, to put it simply, security of uninterrupted supply as the central concept in understanding energy security. Security of infrastructure, so physical infrastructure, emergency response, safety measures, responses to terrorism, sabotage, that kind of thing. The acceptability of consequences in deciding how to approach energy security, so political consequences, social consequences, environmental, and a mostly market-based approach with elements of risk assessment. The widened conception that I'm referring to includes a variety of additional variables. And I include some, but a non-exhaustive list here. So things like the eradication of energy poverty, the security of the environment, or a more broader understanding of sustainability, energy governance, which we are going to see as vital in the case of the EU, energy efficiency, as well as associated areas like the use of renewable energy sources, the circular economy, the development of conceptions of justice, like energy justice, environmental justice, even more recently, climate justice, which we see also expressed through climate change litigation as the most recent trend. And we've also seen a move from the level of analysis from the collective level and the state level as a unitary actor to households and individuals, and even right-based approaches in more recent developments. Next slide. So, what is the EU framework within which the European Green Deal developed and is supposed to operate within the next few years? This may be, of course, common information, but I will go over them really, really quickly. So the targets for 2020 were expressed as, you can see them in red, 20% of use of renewable energy in the energy mix, 20% of energy efficiency. I also include the target on electricity market interconnection, which was at 10% at the time, and also a reduction of 20%, the primary goal of basically EU environmental and energy and climate policy emissions reductions across the EU. In other words, at a collective level, in line with international commitments as well. In 2030, the targets have been revised as following: 32% of renewable energy, which has been revised with the Fit for 55 legislative package to 40%, which has now been proposed to be revised to 45% with Repower EU, to which I will return. Energy efficiency of 32.5%, electricity interconnection of 15%, and of course, like I said, the large goal of a 40% reduction in emissions, in greenhouse emissions, which has already been updated to 45%, and then updated again with the 2030 climate target plan to 55%. All of these are subject to upward revision with the 2023 upcoming revision, about which personally I have my doubts at the moment because of recent events. And the target for 2050 is the well-known target of climate neutrality. This is not just based on the EU, but of course, this is the discussion that is taking place internationally in the pursuit of climate neutrality. But for the EU, it is expressed as such with the European Green Deal. So post publication of the European Green Deal, which of course is not a binding document in any way, we have had two developments. One is the tranche of new policy updates referred to as delivering the European Green Deal, which was published at the same time as the Fit for 55 legislative revision proposals and introduction of new legislative measures. Next slide, please. That includes, I'm not going to go over them because we simply don't have the time. There is main emphasis on two major areas, and what I consider to be the most important thing I put in red there. So the one area is stricter allowances on emissions, especially through the industrial sector with many new developments, and the transport sector, which had been outside of this regime previously, and carbon pricing. And in my opinion, the most important is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is aimed at rebalancing not only internal EU processes, but also external. Next slide, please. So let's start by answering that first question, which I've already answered in the affirmative. Have we seen an adaptation of the conceptualization of energy security by the EU to a widened conception? The answer is absolutely yes. I'm not going to bother at all with the environmental measures, but I include them here because they also prove that we've moved from this traditional to a widened conception. But if we just look at the successive so-called energy packages, we've seen, and I'm numbering them not only as a list of points, but also the packages themselves. We start from a very direct emphasis on the liberalization and harmonization of energy markets, more specifically electricity and gas. Then we move to an understanding of energy security in a very narrow sense, mainly as risk mitigation. However, with the third energy package, there was a huge change in direction with the introduction of an energy governance regime, ownership unbundling measures, and so on, which have been reinforced with the fourth energy package, and we now look forward to the fifth. Now, next slide, please. EU-Russian relations being under tension is nothing new. We have had, I said previously, one might say since the 1990s, but actually, in terms of the ongoing successive gas disputes, especially since 2005, there have been a number of ways in which relations with Russia have affected the way in which the EU approaches energy security. And I break this down in two ways. One is in response to crises, in other words, in the short term, and in response to the anticipation of future crises, in other words, in the long term. So I just give very briefly two examples. So, for example, the obligation on member states to maintain minimum stocks of oil products and measures to safeguard the security of supply, I say gas, not only gas, but also oil, largely in response to the 2008-2009 winter crisis. But also in the long term, we see the prioritization of energy security elements that focus on long-term adaptation. So, for example, the institutionalization of the energy union and an increasingly binding on the member states, that is, energy governance regime. So these are just two examples of many that we can see both in the short term and the long term in terms of how the EU has, to a large extent, responded to Russian relations with Russia, especially over energy, in its updating not only of policy, but also of legislation. So how does this relate to the current crisis? Now, next slide, please. The main response from a policy perspective has been what has already been discussed a lot, of course, Repower EU, where for the first time, and we don't really have the time, of course, to go over policy statements, especially in previous research I've done this, especially in dealing with Russian dependence, where there was really never any overt mention of Russia in any of the attempts to reshape EU energy policy in terms of dependence, in terms of diversification, and so on. For the first time, EU energy policy is directed at Russian dependence, looks to all of these areas around the world for alternative sources of gas, and especially now in terms of LNG, in the form of LNG. But at the same time, Repower EU repositions energy security in terms of efficiency and in terms of the use of alternative sources. So how likely is this to succeed on both of these areas? Well, replacing Russian imports is not going to be easy. Russia contributes about anywhere from 140 to 160 BCM of natural gas to the EU, depending on the estimate that we use in recent years, and that cannot be easily replaced in the short term. Long-term adjustments, and one of the big issues that we can discuss, if you want more details, since I don't have the time to present it, is the really interesting dilemma that this creates right now, and is an aspect that presents a huge policy challenge to the EU, which is trying to find sources of gas and trying to convince actors to invest in gas, whereas at the same time, the incentives to the private sector are both low and actually very problematic in the face of energy transition. Let me put it in simple terms. You cannot convince companies that have been demonized over the past few years to make investment in order to be the saviors of the current situation, only then to demonize them in the future. This is really what the response is right now, especially from the American majors, even though the United States has been so vocal in support of the EU. The same applies to stockpiles. Perhaps you've already read about President Biden's use of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to, in some way, assist the EU. So short-term adjustments are really difficult, especially if they require infrastructural adjustment. The other major mechanism by which especially the United States has been trying to assist in this respect has been in rerouting gas to the EU. But at the same time, long-term contracts and destination clauses, in other words, that prohibit moving gas to the EU under current contracts, present additional hurdles. As an estimate, about 10 to 25% of demand can be met through this method, no more. So that's the first, reducing dependence on Russia. The second is reducing demand. And this seems like an obvious solution to the problem, right? If you don't need more gas and oil, of course, then the solution becomes much easier. The situation becomes much easier to manage. Well, Repower EU suggests three measures. Number one, the EU solar strategy to save about 9 BCM, efficiency measures to save about 35, and industrial measures to save about 22 BCM. This is by somewhere between 2027 and 2030. So this means that the best case scenario is a reduction of about 40 to 45%. I think this best case scenario at the moment is not quite feasible. And the reason it's not is due to a confluence of circumstances. The effects of the pandemic, which have not yet subsided, the supply chain crisis that has followed the pandemic, and of course the war in itself. So next slide, and then I'll finish with my concluding remarks. If we take a look at the broad picture, and once again, this could lead to a very different and extended discussion, and I didn't include the data in order not to make it too confusing. If we ask when and how will not only Russia, but oil and gas become obsolete, it gives us kind of an end game to start thinking back of how to think of this situation moving forward. So EU pledges to the Paris Agreement, most recently the Glasgow Pact, we'll see what happens in Egypt, and the European Green Deal set the end game somewhere between 2030 and 2050. On some issues, it's going to be 2050. On some, it's going to be much, much earlier than that. But global projections vary widely depending on the scenario that it's used. Yeah, I'm running out of time, so let me skip through it really quickly. Basically, the short point to make here is that demand for oil and gas is not going to go down in the next few years. It's going to go up. So I give the estimates there. At the same time, the EU has already moved to speak about banning Russian oil imports by next year. So gas imports and the embargo of such imports is not on the table yet, but we've already seen increasing disruptions, especially to some EU member states. How do these developments change the possibility of achieving the 2030 targets? And I'll skip the discussion on conceptual approaches and finish with this. If you're interested in the theoretical discussion, we can have it later. Well, there's a couple of things to say. Number one, we can see a silver lining in the crisis. And so especially from the climate perspective, this is kind of the optimistic approach, which is to say that the price adjustments that we've seen, the price increases, obviously, that we've seen over the past year, may mean that accelerating the transition will become the cost-effective alternative. So instead of moving towards the same patterns, to change the patterns in order to lower the cost, if obviously the cost-benefit analysis moves us in that direction. However, there is a question of feasibility, and I point to two major issues here. One is the use of intermittent renewable sources, which are the basic sources that we use, wind and solar, and the problem that we have at the moment, which is storage capacity. So unless storage capacity becomes a viable mechanism for these renewable sources, they cannot be the only answer. And secondly, fast-tracking new technologies like hydrogen will still take time. The second thing to say is that the social impact will be severe within the next few years. The price of oil has gone up about 5 times, the price of gas about 6 times. The future markets predict that they will go up even further in 2023. And why would they predict otherwise? Obviously, this is where investing takes place at the moment and forecasting. And the final thing, I shouldn't end on a sour note, but unfortunately I have to. So on the one hand, we have the silver lining. On the other, there is the very credible fear of backtracking on existing progress. Because if the economic environment is such, there will be perhaps new investments that don't lead to accelerating transition, but actually lead to increasing carbon locking. So putting us in much more of a difficult situation in terms of reaching the objectives, and perhaps even the global momentum may stall, which we've already seen indications of in terms of the responses to a new international agreement on greenhouse emissions. So I'll stop there. Again, I'm skipping the theoretical discussion, but perhaps we can discuss it later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, at the end, we will collect them all together. We are running out of time, so I would like to give the floor to our next presenter, Mr. Yannis Kouvardas of the University of Nicosia, a PhD candidate in this institution, who will speak about the role of energy in the strengthening of Turkey-Russia relations.
Hello, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. It's my great honor to be here with you. And I'm very glad to participate in this wonderful process. Today I will talk about the role of energy in the strengthening Turkey-Russia relations in the period 2016-2021. My aim is to clarify the role of energy. Next slide. My aim is to clarify the role of energy in shaping Turkey-Russia relations at this time, and also to identify the causal process through which energy affects Russia-Turkey relations. In order to succeed in my case, I wish two main hypotheses. First, energy contributes to the positive development of Turkey-Russia relations as long as the political relations are already moving in positive direction. Second, Turkey-Russia energy cooperation serves the grand strategy. To test the two hypotheses, a prerequisite condition research will be used through the controlled comparison method in the first case, and the control theory research through the controlled comparison method will be performed in the second case. Also, I'm going to divide my work into 3 case studies. 1, the role of energy in Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy. 2, the role of energy in Russia's concept of being a great power in a multipolar world. 3, the role of energy in the formation of Russia-Turkey relations to smart alignment and flexible competition. Next slide. The theoretical framework of which I will move is that of defensive realism. I will use its principles and theory on international politics and international energy relations. In terms of international politics, these are the following. States are rational and the main actors. The anarchic structure of the international system determines the behavior of states. There is an adequate degree of security in the international system. States seek power to secure their position in the international system. the balance of power between states is constantly changing. The state's quest for power poses security dilemma. States only act aggressively if they feel that their place in the international system is threatened. In terms of international energy relations, these principles are the following. States are the main actors. International energy relations are competitive. Energy security is critical to the security of a state. States use energy as an instrument of power. States are looking for energy power to secure their position in the international system. The economic benefits of energy are subordinated to the political goals of the state. Next slide. In addition, I'm going to dwell on the theoretical framework of energy security and energy power. In terms of energy security, there are two basic preconditions for this to be an issue. First, if an energy raw material is majority in the total primary energy supply of the state, in a percentage equal to or greater than 1/3, if the majority of this consumption greater than equal to 1/3 results from non-substitution of imports or facilities of strategic storage, in this case, this is an issue of import security. Second, if the revenues of a state's budgets come by a majority equal to or greater than 1/3 from the export of an energy raw material, this is the issue of export security. In terms of energy power, this is related to a country's strengths in the fields of production, transit, infrastructure, and energy technology. Next slide. This choice stems from development. These choices of mine stems from development in the international system at this time. Between 2015 and 2021, the process of transforming the international system from unipolar to multipolar is intensifying, but it is not yet complete. The international order is rapidly shrinking, but it is not over. In short, there is an increasing international controversy, but where the possibility of a major war between great powers remains unlikely. In this context, states pursue strong and coercive policies to advance their own interests, while trying to avoid the costs and dangers of using military force. Energy power corresponds to this need. It can damage the economy of a state without military conflict. Next slide. Turkey's grand strategy is based on the developments of the period from mid-2013 to mid-2016. Until mid-2013, Turkey is emerging as a multi-regional power. It projects itself as the leader of the Turkic and Muslim world, and it is boosted by economic growth. Its neo-Ottoman idea is implemented until 2011 through a policy of soft power projection and zero problems, and then with the support for the Arab Spring. From then, however, there will be a sense of sabotage, exclusion, and siege in Ankara. The reasons for this development concerns the domestic, the regional, and the global level. Among others, they come from challenges posed by the PKK, the Gulen movement. They have to do with the formation of a PID-led administration in eastern Syria, the emergence of the Islamic State, the exhaustion of the Arab Spring, and the Russia's annexation of Crimea and its military intervention in Syria. But they are more about the cooperation of their Western allies with the PID and their attitude towards the Gulenists. In this context, the insistence on neo-Ottoman values, which in the summer of 2013 was described as precious holiness, is insufficient for the Turkish leadership. Next slide. Since then, neo-Ottomanism will be integrated into a new strategy: the search for autonomy in the international system, the search for free and independent political action. There are three main pillars to this strategy: absolute domestic stability, regional leadership, more involvement in shaping global affairs. Also, there are three main policies: unilateral action against threats coming from neighboring countries, with the use of military force if needed, prevention of other powers from being in a position of superiority in its region, unilateral, but also through negotiations with allies and rivals. Finally, the strategic hedging of the United States. Next slide. Turkey's energy priorities stem from Turkey's need to increase its economic security and autonomy, and its willingness to use energy as a means of influence. This means improving its energy security, in Turkey's case, the security of imports, reducing the share of energy in its trade deficit, and upgrade its position as a natural gas transit state. As a result, Turkish policies are moving into the following directions: security of current fossil fuel supply markets, diversification of fossil fuel supply markets, increasing domestic energy production, reducing the cost of importing fossil fuels, especially natural gas, become a natural gas transformation hub through the security of existing routes and the creation of others. Next slide. If Turkey succeeds, it will support the pound and protect its foreign exchange reserves. It will reduce the dependence on the energy supply of its economy on external factors. It will strengthen its position in relations with natural gas exporting and importing countries. Therefore, it will take an important step towards strategic autonomy. Turkey will strengthen its domestic stability, reduce external pressures against it, and expand its means of exerting influence and attracting partners. Next slide. On the other hand, the axis of Russian policy is the creation of a favorable external environment that is a Russian sphere of privileged interests in the post-Soviet space and the equal participation of Russia in the formation of international development. A multipolar world with Russia as a great power is Moscow's grand strategy. Its two main pillars are the formation of a Russian-led network of relations in the post-Soviet space, the Russian-led stabilization of strategic balance in the international system, and the building of a network of mutually beneficial international relations. Moscow sees US policy of containing Russia and maintaining dominance in the international system as its main threat. Russia is trying to tow out the United States from this policy. It is pursuing a policy of selective cooperation with them and at the same time balancing them unilaterally and in cooperation with other emerging powers. Next slide. Russia's energy priorities are related to economic security and its maintenance as an energy superpower. That is why Moscow is trying to secure its hydrocarbon exports and also to expand its influence in global and regional fossil fuel markets. For this reason, Russia is pursuing the following policies. It seeks to secure and expand hydrocarbon exports to the EU. It tries to diversify its hydrocarbon exports from the European Union to emerging economies, mainly in Asia. It is interested in having a greater contribution to the formation of the price of oil through its cooperation with other major producers and the penetration of its companies in the production process of other countries. Next slide. The implementation of these policies will stimulate the Russian economy, strengthen Russia's position in its relations with consumer-grade powers such as China and the European Union, multiply Russia's partnerships with emerging powers. Eventually, Moscow will be able to move forward with its military modernization plan and reserve its economy towards high-value sectors. It will also expand its international influence and be able to further establish the model of bilateral relations it promotes worldwide. Next slide. It follows from the great strategies of Russia and Turkey that the crucial factor for the development of the relations is the need for cooperation between them in order to hedge in the case of Turkey, or to balance in the case of Russia, the West. In this context, the relationship will be upgraded from intense competition by the end of 2015 to smart alignment and flexible competition by the end of 2021. This type of relation is not an alliance or strategic partnership. It is a conjunctural event through which the two powers attract each other to promote their interests. Their competition continues in many areas, but they have a defensive position while trying to expand their cooperation to as many new areas as possible. Next slide. The energy cooperation between Turkey and Russia is helped by Turkey's intentions to continue the imports of Russian fossil fuels, to bypass Ukraine as a supply route for Russian natural gas, to become a hub for the transport of natural gas to the European Union, to produce nuclear power. Furthermore, there are also the Russian plans, such as to bypass Ukraine for exporting natural gas to the European Union, to continue export oil through Turkish straits, to continue export hydrocarbons to Turkey, to export nuclear plants. As a result, the Russia-Turkey energy relations will be enhanced. Turk Stream 1 and Turk Stream 2 natural gas pipelines will be completed, and the construction of the Agu nuclear power plant will proceed. On the other hand, disputes over the duration and extent of Turkish gas imports into the new contracts will be resolved. Similarly, an attempt is being made to strike a balance between Turkey's ambition to play a key role in diversifying EU natural gas imports from Russia and Russia's intention to have a monopoly in the EU gas market. Respectively, a compromise solution is sought in the political economic contradictions that caused by Turkish ambitions regarding the Istanbul Canal. In the end, consequently, energy plays a crucial role in the implementation of the Russian and Turkish grand strategies. As a result, energy relations between Russia and Turkey are strengthening, and this has a positive impact on the development of Turkey-Russia relations as a whole. However, energy is not the basis of their development. This base is the political will to cooperate with each other in order to hedge or balance the West. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next presenter, our next speaker will be Dr. Theodoros Tsagiris of the University of Nicosia. Dr. Tsagiris, the floor is yours. Of course. Ναι, θα τα αλλάζω εγώ τις διαφάνειες. Αλλά μπορείς να το ελέγξεις και απλώς να... Είναι το... Βγάζεις από εκεί. Απλώς θα πρέπει να κάνω share.
Okay. Αυτό έτσι όπως είναι.
Ναι, πρέπει να το κάνω share εδώ. You may start.
Ευχαριστώ. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'm going to try to do is try to give you an overview with a focus on natural gas of the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on EU energy strategy with regards to gas and how that would affect existing strategies of the Southern Gas Corridor, as well as the possibilities of tapping into the resources, the reserves and potential resources of the Eastern Mediterranean. The first introductory remark would be to give you an understanding of what we are currently living through since February 24, 2022 has been essentially a very peculiar situation where the European Union, on the one hand, has squarely put has completely identified and aligned itself diplomatically and strategically with Ukraine. Even though it doesn't participate directly in the war as a combatant, it is an economic combatant against Russia. It is at the forefront of the most significant, the most aggressive, and the most potentially costly set of sanctions and restrictive measures against the Russian economy ever taken since the end of the Cold War. okay, the protagonist or on the economic forefront of the war and the front line of the war is the European Union, it's not the United States. And it's the European Union which is going to have and has already the most negative direct effects, both directly and indirectly in its economies, and it's something that is going to continue and being built up in the next months. What we're seeing right now is so the European Union on one side is a direct combatant in that war in the economic front. On the other hand, it has to, or at least should, whether it does, it's a different question, to balance this reality against the very direct cost of the continued dependency on Russian energy, okay? And on the fact that it needs to be able to understand, not only to hopefully to correct the policies that led here to the level of dependency that we are seeing and we have seen at the beginning of the war, and the geopolitical constraints this dependency has imposed on its ability to have a more autonomous foreign policy right now. And we're seeing that Europe as a whole, and even the major European powers, are absent from the diplomatic front of the Russian-Ukrainian war to the extent that it still exists, such a front, okay? But one would suggest and one would expect that since Europe is the one who has the biggest direct losses from this confrontation, to see Europe playing alone or leading a role in terms of a diplomatic initiative to try to find some sort of a ceasefire to the extent that it's possible, because it's not. So it's a very difficult geopolitical exercise. Europe is absent politically. It has fully aligned with the United States, and it is in its own understanding, it is incurring and it is being afflicted to the economic pain of its very large dependence on Russian oil and gas and other forms of energy, okay, including coal, including, of course, the only source of energy was never been mentioned in the debate of sanctions against Russia, which is nuclear fuel, of course, which covers the entire eastern part of every reactor built to the west, to the east, in Eastern Europe in Soviet times. When it comes to natural gas, the situation is even more difficult and even more complex in the sense that as part of Europe's decarbonization policy, which has taken a very, very strong and very uncompromising and very polemic to a certain extent tone after 2019 within the context of the Green Deal, gas, and there have been cycles and specific policies within the EU that have tried to demonize essentially the natural gas industry in Europe. And the result of that was an industry is not stupid. Industry is trying to play out a form of alignment with the general market conditions. It's moving away from Europe with regards to oil and gas developments. In terms of oil and gas, in terms of oil and gas developments, especially gas developments, which have led to the complete collapse of European indigenous production. 10 years ago, Europe received about one third of its gas needs, or about 20% of its gas needs, from Europe. Okay, go back to the beginning of the Cold War, more than 60% was indigenous production of gas. And until 2019, the overall principle of the European strategy was that we want the energy transition, obviously, nobody could argue about that, but gas would be the bridging fuel. Okay, suddenly after 2019, somebody decided that it should be set, it should be ostracized completely from the European energy security strategy, which in certain extent has become almost a contradiction in terms. The end result of that was very, very obvious. Production collapsed. By collapsed, I mean it dropped 70% in 5 years. Since 2019, it dropped by 50%. And the gap was covered by what? The cheapest possible available supplier. And that cheapest possible available supplier is here. Is this one, who also has the biggest reserves. The second largest production after 2015, because it was supplanted by the United States because of the shale gas revolution, and is by far the largest reserves holder and the biggest exporter, and has always been the biggest exporter to 2014 in Europe. And the interesting thing is that since 2014, which is the first Russian-Ukrainian war, and the awakening, so-called awakening of Europe to the fact that, my God, the sources of gas from Russia are not as secure politically as we thought, that was the idea. The level net dependence of the EU 28, which UK, that was about 30%. Okay? In the less than 7 years after that event, even if you include the UK as part of the European, you will talk about EU 27 today, the two major hypotheses of the European Commission at the time that A, gas is going to drop as a part of our energy mix, and B, energy dependence on Russia is already too high, so it should drop. Both of them were proven false. The demand actually increased a little bit by 20 to 30 BCM, was 420 in 2014, 2021, if not mistaken, it was 455, something like that, which is still low because of the pandemic. If we didn't have the pandemic, the situation would have been quite different. But the level of net import dependence, and that is structure. No, sorry, that's not that. Sorry, this is the construction in Europe. But anyway, the composition of Russian gas. But more importantly, in Europe, it was about 30% in terms of net demand, 40% in terms of imports. By 2021, it was 40% of demand, 42, and 53% of imports. When the war started, it had increased by approximately a quarter, 25% more. At the same time, what has happened within Russia, and this is what I wanted to show you, because it's not only important to see from where the production comes and what are the reserves, but what is the composition of that? And the composition is not what the Europeans thought as a monopoly of production. No, actually, it's not. 70% of all the gas that is produced in Russia at the time is Gazprom. Now it's below 60% because there's an area of additional companies which are either private, Novatek, for example, or partly state-owned like Lukoil, or private like Lukoil, or more importantly like Rosneft, which is a Russian state company, who have their own gas production, mostly associated gas. So what has happened is that Russia has actually changed its modus operandi. It's become more investment friendly. It's improved its ability to import FID, increase production despite sanctions on its production capacity since 2014, despite sanctions, and also increase its exports in terms of production and consumption. Importantly, it also increased the amount of energy from Sakhalin, from Yamal, from Arctic LNG, which all of them are LNGs that are currently being constructed with European FID, primarily from France, and to a certain extent by China, and to a lesser extent by India. India is stepping up very quickly to replace that. So the situation where we found ourselves in Europe is a situation which is a very violent awakening from an understanding that on the one hand, you have a very, very significant immediate dependence that goes up to 40% of final consumption of gas. On the other hand, to a need to confront Russia's strategy with the perception that if you stop Russian gas coming to Europe somehow, you're going to damage the Russian war machine or limit its ability to finance the war and its operations, and in the medium to long term, starve Russia, one of its principal sources of energy, of finance, of capacity, of value. Well, that's not actually the case, because if you look at the composition, when people are talking about gas, they should actually have said oil and oil products, not natural gas. Natural gas represents about 20 to 25% of Russian revenue. Okay, and the Russian revenue comes primarily, this is 2013 data, you can see even more data here with regards to its share of the federal budget. Okay, out of the 45% of all Russian Federation revenues, which came from oil and gas, and by gas I mean the main export tax, because this is how the Russian state is 50%, gets most of its money from exports, not from domestic taxation, because within Russia it's very cheap to sell oil and gas. It's just about, from the 45%, it's about 20% of that, even less. Okay, so for Russia to be able to continue to export to Europe is significant, but it's not the key. The key is the oil embargo, the oil boycott. And this is how you could see the change in terms of the percentage all the way to 2019. When the war began, it was about 45%. Out of that, gas represented about 7 to 8. All gas, 5.6 of revenue. Okay, and 5.6% of that was just for Europe, excluding Turkey. Okay, Turkey is no longer is not part of OECD or Europe in terms of its policies of Russia. Okay, partly because, as our future colleague mentioned, it has its own foreign policy and its own understanding. So when we talk about Russian exports to West, we have to exclude Turkey from the West. This is a composition of where Russian gas was going in 2016. About a quarter was going to non-OECD, non-European destinations. The Turkish part was quite significant. Okay, so actually back in 2016, before the major exports started in China, as you can see here, China is absent because the gas pipeline was not yet commissioned. The gas pipeline for which it actually exports 28 BCM today was not in operation. So basically it's 25% plus Turkey plus China. If you look at that share of non-OECD, non-EU actually, non-EU exports, the share of total exports of Russia, which are going outside the European, outside sanctioned area, is about 35%. And it's expanding because as the Europeans are trying to move away from Russia, Russia is doing exactly the same thing by tapping into these reserves. Actually, here this is actually in Power of Siberia, the first pipeline going to China. It has a contract which the pipeline started to work with 38 BCM capacity. A few weeks before the war started, they expanded by another 10 BCM. So 50 by 2025 out of the 155 that you mentioned, approximately 1/3 would be going to China alone to China. And the second and most important is this one, the second ESPO pipeline, the Vostok pipeline, which would be actually, here it is, which would be.
Sorry for interrupting you. I'm just mentioning that in 5 minutes there will be an assembly.
Yes, okay.
So
just a few minutes.
Mind.
What I wanted to say is that this part of Siberia too, if it's constructed by 2030, it would add another 50 billion cubic meters. So as the Europeans are thinking they're trying to diversify away from Russia, so are the Russians. And they are doing, and they have proven to be much more quickly actually capable in doing that than the Europeans. So initially the Europeans tried to react in two ways. The first one, and that's part of their power, the others, that initially we're going to move away from Russia. We're 1 year, 65% off. By 2027, no gas imports. Very well. Then we're going to treat cancer and find communications with the aliens in some way, because this is equally supernatural powers to be able to do that in such a short period of time. And even if you find somehow the non-existing scientific way to do it, there's a very small detail which has to do with money, of course, which unelected officials in Brussels don't care about, especially given their salary. But you could look at this. This is the structure of trade, which tells you how the long-term contracts in Europe are structured. Long-term contracts mean that provide security of demand to somebody who has bought it. So if you have a 10 BCM contract and you have a take or pay clause for 80%, it means that out of the 10, out of the 8 that you have to consume, even if you consume only 3, you still have to pay for 8. So if somebody in Brussels would come up with an idea of how to not pay that, it would be a very good idea to do it very quickly. Unfortunately, the money tree doesn't grow in Brussels. I don't know where it grows, but it doesn't grow in Brussels. So this is a very good reason why this rapid de-Russification of the European import, that is not going to happen. So if it's not going to happen, it is a major impediment. So if we don't find alternative gas from some, we need to find alternative gas from somewhere else, but this is not going to happen automatically. In Greece, for example, after 2026, it would be possible because the long-term contracts are going to phase out for DEPA and Kopelouzos, Prometheus gas. But if they decide to stop paying now, stop buying now, stop consuming now, they will still have to pay. And they're going to need that money to do something else, which is what? Move away from gas, as the REPowerEU would like us to think, or find alternative gas. Where should they find alternative gas? Well, there are specific options. The first one is Qatar, after 2026. The second one is, of course, the United States, which would need somebody to buy to give them a guarantee for 20 years for them to begin investing in new facilities, because currently, as you also mentioned, there are no availabilities. What they're doing in redirecting the flow of gas, as you can see here, to Europe, is breaking long-term deliveries with the acceptance of the importing parties, or to direct some of it to Europe. But that's only for an emergency basis. It doesn't happen from one day to another. You have to build up capacity. So if they are building capacity, they need somebody to finance it, and that somebody is not readily available because the European Union has a different policy. It says, we need more gas, but don't give us more gas after 2030, because after 2030, the gas should disappear. So the question mark is, if there isn't a leftovendro, a money-making tree, and if somebody doesn't have enough gas to 2030, how am I going to be able to convince a company in Qatar or the US, or most friendly US, or Norway, or whatever, in other parts of the world, to invest in gas, that the investment should stop or start to decline after 2030, if the gas is not even available today? How am I going to do that? I have to agree, I have to accept that I'm going to need gas beyond 2030. Okay, and they're not even willing to do that. That's the most paradoxic, which is a diplomatic way of saying crazy, thing about the European Union. Alternative sources of imports, yes, theoretically there are. There's Algeria, there is Norway, there are, but they want demand security, and they're not giving them demand security because the demonization of gas supply and gas in Europe continues. It hasn't stopped because of the war in Ukraine. It has accelerated because of the war in Ukraine. So if they haven't been able to find this 50, 60 plus BCM to reduce Russian gas, the core of the REPowerEU strategy is to eliminate gas. Not eliminate Russian dependence on gas. Eliminate gas by 2030, which is going to be replaced by what? This is a different story. But within this context, how is this relevant? And what of all these plans, how could they be relevant? Well, the only thing which is relevant is something that could be built very quickly, and that is LNG. That's phase one of the exports. The second would be small-scale LNG projects that would go to Greece, and through Greece, through a simple structure of pipelines further to the north. And of course, smaller pipeline connections between countries which could use either existing facilities in Egypt or new facilities in the areas, but small scale, not the big ones we had in mind, $12, $14 billion. Let's build a 2-train LNG in Cyprus. This doesn't exist, but smaller solutions, more modular solutions could be part of this solution, this agreement, including only if it becomes hydrogen compatible pipeline infrastructure of a longer strategic importance, such as the Eastern Gas Pipeline, or pipelines connecting Crete with Greece and then linking into the Eastern Gas Pipeline. Okay, apart from the geopolitical part of it, it has to make sense. You cannot, the only way actually, to build more infrastructure in terms of pipelines, which would be compatible with the long-term goal of energy transition, is to make them compatible with hydrogen, which is what essentially restructure it, repurpose it, replan it so as to build an infrastructure that should be built for hydrogen, even though you don't have any hydrogen to put in it. So you put gas, and then you start mixing up hydrogen so that in the long term, for 10, 15, 20 years, it would be a hydrogen-only infrastructure. This is a potential compromise solution because You cannot convince somebody to invest billions of dollars to build new infrastructure, to build new capacity for exports if you're telling them, no, it's only up to 2030, 2031, 2032, but that's as far I can go with that because my conscience of whatever you have in your callous mind is going to rebel. That's the reality, and that's the conflicting situation that's been reacting here. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I've taken, I don't know, 10% more, 20% more of your time. I'd be happy to discuss.
I have a small question. I know you are stressed at the time.
As long as they don't invade.
Benefit
They are what to invade.
exactly. Benefit from the wisdom of
They are outside waiting, but we can use some
Thank
of
you
the
very much.
time.
First of all, congratulations to all the speakers. It was well worth the investment of time. So evidently, the energy is demonized, as Mr. Zakir said, weaponized in the geopolitical game against Russia.
Not energy, gas.
Again,
And
this is imposing a huge cost on the European citizens. So what will all this have as an outcome in the end, developing the southern corridor, in terms of a compromise with Turkish demands in the East Med?
No, cannot compromise with Turkish
What will be the outcome in your
because
opinion?
if we compromise, this is for me, sorry, the question.
For everybody, Mr. Christo, who said, the transition is going to be cost effective. This is at best a fallacy at worst poor propaganda. It's imposing a huge cost on the current generation. Everybody can see. In terms of East Med and Cyprus, I mean, that's my main basic point.
Yeah.
What was the question?
The question is,
Should we compromise to get
the outcome of the war? What will be the outcome in terms of developing the Cyprus and East Med reserves?
Well, it would be beneficial in the sense that there is an urgent need to understand that you have to increase the flow to Europe.
Mhm.
How you're going to do that is a different question. So the immediate answer would be, The immediate answer would be use this infrastructure, these LNGs, by connecting them to pipelines directly with the fields here, and use that to export to Europe and where most of the gas is needed, which is to the north of Greece through the Greek network, because we have one future LNG here and a pipeline connecting to Bulgaria, have another one to connect with Northern Macedonia. And we have, by building up capacity in the Greek network, we can have additional entry points to tap the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which is the main infrastructure that implements the Southern Gas Corridor, both from Alexandroupoli as well as, most importantly, here from Nea Mesembria. So if you can get gas from the Eastern Med here or here, your market is not only the Balkan market, which is closed right now, but you could also load it to tap so as to reduce the importance of Turkey for this strategic city. So it's a shortcut that you would only get otherwise only by pipelines, which are very expensive, very complicated, quite risky, even though for geopolitical, there are other plans, other technology you could use to destroy the Madivatan concept, and that is a cable of electricity, not a pipeline necessarily. But if you want to have a pipeline, you need to understand that you're going to have to carry hydrogen, which doesn't exist.
Energy recently suggested an FSRU in Cyprus terminal.
An FSRU is just another.
To Greece, again, the same outcome will be the same outcome with the FSRU.
No, the FSRU here in offshore Vasilikos, this is what it is, for an LNG would be 3 to 4 BCM, so it's quite limited. And it would be an export LNG. If you liquefy it here, you can take it to Europe, but you could also take it through the canal to Asia. It doesn't have to go to Europe. It can go anywhere as an export LNG. An import LNG, which is the FSRU here in Alexandroupolis, or an expansion of capacity here in Athens, or a second FSRU, which is being built here in the Gulf of Corinth. These are additional imports of supply that after 2026 could replace completely Russian gas. That's a strategic importance of that. But the capacity is too big for Greek needs. That's why Greece could develop a gateway both to the north and to the west through TAP. If you have to build an East Med, which would include gas, this is a different story how you're going to do it, but you need to include hydrogen. If it's not hydrogen linked, it won't be built because nobody's going to finance it. Why? Because it doesn't have to finance a stranded asset that would need 10, 15, 20 years to get its money back. That's the change that's the biggest impact of the energy transition and the war on the geopolitics of the region. It has to be hydrogen ready for big infrastructure, for smaller and medium infrastructure that could also operate through LNG. And the geopolitical importance, which is to destroy this in find ways of implementing your own vision, has to be climate friendly in a way. Geopolitical necessities have to become climate friendly. And climate friendly, there's nothing more climate friendly than a cable for which we already have more than half of the money to build it, by the way, which is Eurasia.
Will they give a role to Turkey in this respect?
Who will give their role? We?
European Union.
I don't care what the European Union will do. The European Union has financed one project, which is Eurasia. From Eurasia is clear where it will have to go through. Okay? It's clear. It can't go otherwise because Cyprus cannot be bypassed. Why? Because the converter is going to be in Kofinu. And Cyprus is going to be the link between Greece and Israel. Understand? So Cyprus can be bypassed in terms of gas. You don't have to build a pipeline to Cyprus. No, you don't have to build nothing. So you don't have to have compressor here to go to Greece. You can put it here and go to Greece. The pipeline would be only for your own needs, which you don't need, by the way, since you're going to have a different story. But for electricity, Cyprus is essential. And it's much more important because without Cyprus, there is no connection to Israel. Israel doesn't have a reason to support the project. Support, I mean strategically support, or theoretically, strategically support. Because Cyprus and Israel share a common vulnerability. What? They're both energy islands, which means that if they don't have interconnections, electricity exchange and storage, they won't be able to build up their renewable electricity potential. The cost is going to remain high. And they won't have the ability to be able to move ahead in the process of the energy, of the climate transition, and the energy transition, because they have renewable electricity capacity that they cannot develop if they remain isolated. That's why. And it's also an issue of security of supply for electricity, because in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to electrify everything if we're going to move away from hydrocarbon resources. Okay, and we should do that, but it shouldn't be done on a political clock. It should be done on a technological availability clock that could be economically financed and strategically sustained, because the energy transition, if it happens too quickly, you have to mind the gap that you're opening between what technology can give you and what your own wishes should, or your wishful thinking, or your wishes. Because, yeah, I'd love to, do this and have all the energy I need from the sun and have no pollution. But if I try to do that for 100% in an island, which is cut off, and this is also an island, by the way, I won't have electricity. Now, you know what? The cost of an electricity blackout is much bigger than an oil boycott or an oil embargo, monetary-wise and social-wise, because we can live without a car for 7 days. We cannot live without electricity for 7 days. That's the big difference.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay. Thank you, everybody.